Hi, I'm Sherry. In this video, I will present my report, Charm Offensive Amid the Tariff War, China's Diplomatic Engagement in Southeast Asia and the Strategic Echoes from the United States. This presentation follows the structure of my report, which is organized into 8 parts. Introduction, core arguments, China's diplomatic strategies, Southeast Asian countries' responses, America's reactions, the evolving roles of China and the United States in the global order, conclusion, and future prospect. In April 2025, Chinese President Xi Jinping visited 3 Southeast Asian countries, Malaysia, Vietnam, and Cambodia. Amid Donald Trump's threat of tariffs at that moment, Xi Jinping's visit has been widely interpreted as a move in China's charm offensive, which aimed at winning influence without overt coercion through the strategic campaign of goodwill gestures such as high-level visits, development aid, and rhetorical appeals. Although the United States and China agreed to temporarily reduce tariffs recently, many punitive measures remain in place, and the future trajectory of enforcement remains uncertain. Therefore, it is still critical to assess China's long-term strategy, Southeast Asian varied responses, and the United States' intentions, because these dynamics will continue to shape the region's institutional balance, strategic alignments, and normative order regardless of short-term trade fluctuations. For this report, I draw on diverse sources, including government documents from both the United States and the People's Republic of China, think tank reports, news articles, expert interviews, and commentaries. Above all, Southeast Asia is a geopolitical construct. Each nation is distinct. Future research could benefit from incorporating additional sources from each individual Southeast Asian countries, as well as perspectives from key American allies in the broader Indo-Pacific. To begin with, it is important to analyze the implications of Xi Jinping's visit within the broader context of foreign policy trends in both China and the United States. China operates on what I call a dual-track strategy: charm in diplomacy, firmness in security. This approach allows China to project soft power through economic aid, development projects, and infrastructure initiatives, while simultaneously exerting its military presence in maritime spaces and other contested areas. The United States, on the other hand, blends conditional idealism with transactional bargaining. It treats alliances somewhat like business partnerships when seeking economic or strategic returns, yet invokes democratic ideals such as human rights when disciplining allies or justifying pressures if alignment falters. Against this backdrop, Xi Jinping's visit can be seen as a proactive diplomatic breakthrough under the shadow of U.S. tariff pressure. While Southeast Asian nations welcome Chinese investment and market access, most of them practice cautious balancing or maintain strategic ambiguity between Beijing and Washington. American thought leaders and policymakers generally assess China's charm offensive as more symbolic than structurally transformative, though they remain alert to the rising power of China's Global South narrative and its potential influence over the international order. China aims to radiate global influence through neighboring diplomacy, using both head of state and defense diplomacy as key tools. Under Xi Jinping, head of state diplomacy marks a shift from simply inviting foreign leaders to Beijing towards personally knocking on their doors. Xi seeks to establish narrative dominance within the Pan-Asian discursive space by promoting concepts like a community of shared future, peaceful development, anti-unilateralism, and Asian solidarity. Meanwhile, defense diplomacy focuses on expanding China's security periphery and legitimizing its regional presence. Beijing promotes a non-Western model of military relations, emphasizing principles such as sovereignty, non-intervention, and collective development. However, from the perspective of the United States and its allies, many of China's defense activities are perceived as gray zone coercion, actions that fall below the threshold of open conflict but still apply pressure. Xi Jinping also seeks to advance China-centered multilateralism by enhancing China's normative power through regional economic interdependence. Beijing has initiated multilateral projects such as the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, the Global Development Initiative, and the Belt and Road Initiative. Through these activities, China frames development as a sovereign and collective endeavor, positioning itself as a central hub in the regional and global order. China often does not rely on overt coercion. Instead, it prefers to create path dependency by building institutions and committing resources, which gradually lock other countries into economic and institutional reliance. As a result, even when Southeast Asian nations avoid explicitly choosing sides, they remain highly dependent on China across multiple dimensions. In the end, China's goals extend beyond economic expansion. It also seeks narrative dominance, normative power, and ideological influence in the regional and global arenas. In Malaysia, Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim welcomed Xi Jinping warmly. While no major new agreements were signed during the visit, both sides emphasized the importance of deepening trade and supply chain cooperation, particularly under the RCEP framework. With the American tariffs on Malaysian goods reaching up to 24%, Malaysia has become increasingly reliant on China for manufacturing partnerships and infrastructure support. Malaysia's approach can be described as institutional cooperation within the political ambiguity. It stresses a unified Asian stance and carefully avoids visibly tilting toward either major power. Turning to Vietnam, American tariffs reached as high as 46% at the time. Despite this, Vietnam has maintained strategic composure by pursuing a non-aligned but counterbalancing strategy. It continues its defense cooperation with the United States while keeping communication channels open with China. Although maritime tensions with China persist in the South China Sea, Vietnam still welcomes Chinese economic investment and broadly supports China's Global South strategy. Compared to Malaysia and Vietnam, Cambodia maintains a much closer relationship with China. Ahead of Xi Jinping's visit to Phnom Penh, the United States imposed punitive tariffs up to 49% of Cambodian solar exports. In contrast, China remains Cambodia's primary provider of infrastructure investment and political backing. Chinese investment in Cambodia now totals $34 billion, accounting for nearly half of the country's total foreign capital inflows. Cambodia has moved swiftly to institutionalize China-Cambodia community of shared future, deepening its alignment with Beijing. Overall, Malaysia, Vietnam, and Cambodia demonstrate different levels of dependence on China. While the United States' unpredictability and tariff threats often act as a foil to China's reliability and consistency, Southeast Asian nations continue to maintain strategic poise and independence, carefully navigating between the two powers. American thought leaders from think tanks, scholarly institutions, and policy community have offered several key interpretations and recommendations in response to China's diplomatic moves. First, they argue that Xi Jinping's diplomatic outreach aims to undermine U.S. regional influence. According to this view, Xi Jinping's tour serves as a soft cover, using economic benefits and political goodwill to mask underlying military pressures, ultimately laying the groundwork for a China-led regional order. Second, these analysts strongly criticize China's gray zone coercion in contested territories, particularly in the South China Sea, and call for ASEAN countries to take more assertive steps to counter China's dominance. Third, they warn that America's unpredictable foreign policies, including sudden tariff hikes and shifting strategic signals, may unintentionally push Southeast Asian countries to align more closely with China, simply because Beijing appears more consistent and reliable. In light of these concerns, American experts recommend that the United States strengthen its non-military instruments of regional engagement. More specifically, they urge Washington to enhance regional security mechanisms while also restoring economic assistance and expanding market access to ensure that America remains an attractive and credible partner for the Southeast Asia. Xi Jinping's diplomatic strategies reflect the evolving roles of China and the United States within the global order. China seeks to break free from a unipolar system dominated by the United States and instead help shape a multipolar world. In contrast, the United States is increasingly focused on defending its traditional dominance, often through more inward-looking and short-sighted means. For decades, China benefited from American-led global order, especially since the reform and opening era, gaining access to platforms like the World Trade Organization, the World Bank, and other international institutions. However, since Xi Jinping's rise to power, China has begun to challenging certain international norms and promoting institutional alternatives. Xi Jinping has advanced China-led initiatives such as Belt and Road Initiative, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, and the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. Through these efforts, Xi Jinping seeks to reduce China's dependency on Western platforms and brings Global South countries into a China-led governance model. China has also become more proactive in shaping global narratives. Xi Jinping's visit to Malaysia, Vietnam, and Cambodia projects China as a reliable partner, counteracting the uncertainty created by the United States policies and using economic incentives to reshape supply chains and build political capital. This shift marks China's evolution from a developing country focused primarily on trade to a systemic power that integrates economic, diplomacy, and security into a cohesive global strategy. Meanwhile, the United States foreign policy has shifted from conditional idealism toward a more transactional bargaining. As Singapore's defense minister Huang Yonghong famously put it, Asia once saw America as a liberator, now it sees it as a landlord collecting rent. After the Cold War, the United States served as a principal architect of the global liberal order, promoting open markets, multilateralism, and institutional governance. However, in recent years, American foreign policy has leaned toward transactional logic, focusing less on shared values and more on expected terms. This unpredictability has pushed smaller states that once dependent on U.S. security guarantees to adopt greater strategic autonomy. America's withdrawal from multilateral mechanisms, such as its non-participation in RCEP and reduced funding to regional bodies like the Mekong River Commission, has contributed to the perception of unreliability. More critically, America's selective adherence to international law is widely seen as applying double standards, undermining its legitimacy in the region. For example, the United States has refused to ratify the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, while invoking freedom of navigation principles in the South China Sea. In this US-China rivalry, Southeast Asia stands at the strategic crossroads and serves as a transitional zone. Regional actors are not passive. They actively carve out space for agency, using ASEAN collectivism as a tool to navigate and leverage the competition between the two major powers. In conclusion, China is actively re-engineering structural dependence in Southeast Asia through institutional innovation and economic rebinding, steadily deepening its influence across the region. The United States faces the erosion of its traditional dominance and has turned to tariffs and military alliances as tactical tools, though its broader strategic vision appears increasingly inward-looking and fragmented. Southeast Asian countries are not passive players in this rivalry. Rather, they actively shaping space within regulatory gray zones, skillfully pursuing non-alignment without marginalization by leveraging multilateral engagement and maintaining strategic flexibility. Looking ahead, regional integration mechanism will play an increasingly critical role as buffers against great power conflicts, providing Southeast Asia with tools to navigate external pressures. The United States risks losing long-term strategic depth in the region if it fails to rebuild its multilateral credibility and restore trust among its partners. At the same time, China might face long-term reputational costs if it does not restrain its use of gray zone coercion, which could alienate neighbors despite its economic appeal. Xi Jinping's recent visit to Southeast Asia exemplifies China's ambitious grand strategy in the pursuit of a global South consensus, positioning itself as a leader of developing nations. If the United States continue to underestimate the region's emphasis on respect and stability, its traditional alliance architecture may gradually weaken, creating space for new alignments. The future global order will not revolve solely around the US-China binary. Instead, it will likely be defined by fluid coalitions and shifting affinities across multiple issue domains, from economics to security to climate governance. In this context, Southeast Asia is not merely a battleground for power rivalry between the superpowers, but the very cradle of a post-hegemonic global paradigm, where emerging model of cooperation and competition will shape the contours of a 21st century world. Thank you.